Good afternoon. Thank you for giving us your time. So you were invited in Georgia by the Heinrich Böll Foundation, so Georgian Public Broadcaster uses this opportunity to talk with you with regards to the matters that are acute for our time and for our societies. You're a political scientist and you're currently occupying a position of Professor of International Politics at the University of Vienna. And you come from the theoretical tradition which is critical international political economy. And you're working also on social and ecological topics, so resource politics and green economy. You have a pretty critical perspective towards the current processes globally today and specifically to the liberal globalization. So could you talk more specifically about the problems that we face today globally and towards what exactly your criticism is directed?
Mm-hmm. The criticism starts with a completely different understanding of globalization. So usually globalization, the mainstream, the liberal discourse is that globalization just came, that the economy became more global, that this caused some problems for the politics because it remained national, but in fact it's good. From a mainstream perspective, globalization is good, and there are some problems, we need to solve the problems. From a critical perspective, globalization starts in the 1970s as a strategy of capital, of powerful groups to overcome a crisis of profitability, a crisis of profits, of accumulation, which was the crisis of post-war capitalism in the West. And so the answer of capital was to go global. But it's a different interpretation. It was a strategy. And the strategy was also supported by governments. For example, the German government, the Western German government, started to liberate the financial markets. So financial capital became more global, industrial capital became more global. We talked at this time of a new international division of labor. Mm-hmm. So the steel industry went to Korea, the textile industry went to other regions of the world, and then others, the automotive sector. The second wave of globalization was the opening of the East for capital. It was a cheap game to go to the post-Soviet countries, to go to Poland, to the Czech Republic, and to buy there the companies at a cheap price, the RDR, Eastern Germany. So this was also a huge chance for capital to make profits. And the third wave of globalization is the wave of the emerging economies. It is the takeoff of China, of India, when really the emerging economies got their strengths. So this is a critical perspective. From this perspective, we can say globalization is about class struggle. Globalization is about power. Globalization is about domination, and not, as the mainstream says, it just came by over us. Mm-hmm. So, and then globalization produces systematically crisis. The dominant ideology is that globalization will have trickle-down effects. If the world economy grows enough, also the poor will have something out of it. But the critical perspective says globalization, in the globalization process, the state itself, explicitly or maybe only as an effect, gave over some opportunities to rule capital, to put rules to capital. I already said the liberation of financial markets, which caused such a huge, not only growth of the amount of the sheer amount of financial, but of the power of financial markets. So who can today regulate the financial markets? Who can today regulate free trade? The states agreed on the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It was a political decision. So this is the perspective. So the first problem is that for the states, it becomes more difficult to act against capital. They are regulating, but usually they are regulating in favor of capital. A very good example is the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, mm-hmm. that the states, the national states and the EU saved capital. They saved the banks, they saved the automotive sector. So the social aspects of the state, the environmental strengths of the state or the environmental policies, they were weakened according to tendency, and the strong economic functions were strengthened. So who is benefiting from globalization? Mm-hmm. I refer to a study by Branko Milanovic, who is a Serbian economist at the World Bank, and he has its famous model, his elephant model, and he argues that during 1988 and 2008, during these 20 years, two groups largely benefited from globalization. One group is the emerging middle classes in the emerging economies, China, India, Brazil, maybe also Russia, but Russia is more oligarchic. So they really benefited, and who most benefited from globalization are the elites. The elites who have the assets, the economic elites, which are often also the political elites. Those who have the assets, those who have the wealth, they profited even more from globalization. And two groups lose, according to Milanovic, in the globalization process between 88 and 2008. This is his data. The first group is the lower middle classes of the old capitalist centers, the workers, those who have now precarious jobs, and those who lose most are the poor in the global south. And so this is the effect. And then we could also talk about the environmental damage, that the resources are even more used and the environment is menaced, climate change and others.
Here I would also ask you, what do you exactly mean under the global south? Because you just highlighted that those who are losing particularly are the poor of the global south.
So the global south is a bit a fuzzy concept. I prefer global south using it instead of periphery or semi-periphery. The global south means a position in the world economy and in world politics, and it wants to indicate that the global north are the old industrialized countries, and then we have a group in between, China, India, Russia and others, and then we have the global south as countries which are usually we say the developing countries. But the global north and the global south wants to indicate that within the global north, within Germany, within Austria, within the United States, there is a global south. There is a lot of poverty. There are coming the migrants. There are people who live illegally and so on. So there's the global south. And in the so-called global south, there is a global north. If we think about the elites and the upper middle classes in China, in India and Russia, their mode of living, their lifestyle is very similar to the West, to the United States, to Western Europe. So this should be indicated.
I just wanted to touch this issue of lifestyle. You and your colleague Markus Wissen developed the theory of imperial mode of living, by which you indicate that today the world market, basically as we know it, somehow enables the situation where people's everyday lives and everyday practices and also their identities are somehow relying on several different things. And first, this is an unlimited appropriation of resources, and as you write, the second is the cheap labor coming from around the world, but elsewhere, not from the global north, and disproportionate claim to global and local ecosystems and things. So in a nutshell, the world market in that way diffuses the everyday practices and everyday life, which is somehow problematic. So could you elaborate on these problematic aspects?
With the term imperial mode of living, as you said, we want to make visible that the structures of globalization, of capitalist, neoliberal, imperial globalization, economic structures, the action of transnational corporations, political structures, free trade, cultural structures, racism and others, are complemented and need to be complemented by the everyday actions of people. In their consumption process, if we buy cell phones or use cars or use planes or eat meat or whatever, they have to be produced, but they have also to be consumed, they have to be lived. And also the work of people, and that people in Austria and Germany live better off of their work, they have better incomes, also have to do with the over-exploitation of people in China when they produce the cell phones and others. So this is the major idea. And then we argue against the globalization mainstream, that the imperial mode of living is enabling many people also in the global south, the middle classes of the global south, also to have a better life. Now if you look to China, there was an enormous growth, and you have 250 or 300 million people who really materially live better off, but at the cost of the destruction of the environment and at the cost of others. So we argue that against the dogma of liberal globalization, that at the end everybody will be better off, we argue no, the imperial mode of living as a structural feature of globalization means that it's highly exclusive, that not everybody can live better, but that people in Germany, Austria or the upper classes in Georgia can consume certain cars, certain cell phones, certain food, requires the over-exploitation of labor and of nature in Georgia, in Austria, in Germany, but also elsewhere. So we say in principle there is an unlimited access, but the access of course is linked to income, to money. You have to buy the commodity. I can imagine that the polarization in Georgia, that the rich people, the upper middle classes, they have also, let's say, a Western lifestyle, and they also are very addicted to this lifestyle. They want a cell phone, they want a car, a big car, and they want to travel and so on. And also this is highly exclusive. I don't blame on Georgia. This is not the point. We might come back to this later. Of course, the change must come from the capitalist centers, but we want to highlight that it's not only a problem of the capitalist centers. And this is also against a theorizing or an understanding of globalization that argues in the globalization process the North is better off and the South is worse, and this is not true. I work on Latin America, I'm very often in Latin America, and you have a middle class in the capitals, in the cities. They live quite well, they live Western standards, but again at the cost of their own people, their own workers, at the cost of nature, and also, if you like, at the cost of future. Moreover, we argue, and we want to highlight, we want to make visible that this mode of living has a precondition. That the book in German is very, very successful. We are in media, we are invited to talks, and not only to critical spaces, but also to business administrations, to public talks, because obviously we find an uneasiness in society. People live more or less well in Germany and Austria. Of course, there's a lot of inequality, but the middle classes live more or less well, but they are uneasy with their mode of living. They know that they are destroying nature. They know that they are exploiting others. So we want to make visible what is going on in these countries, and we want to highlight that what we call eco-imperial tensions, that future international tensions might grow because also China has now interest in the land of the Ukraine, or in the land of Africa, what we call land grabbing. Yeah? So there is also that countries like China, Brazil, India are interested in this. And maybe a last aspect, beside many others, we would like to highlight is also that we can understand the rise of the far right. The far right, in our terms, Trump, but also Kurz in Austria and others, they promise their electorate, their potential voters, if you vote for me, I will defend your imperial mode of living. I will secure that the migrants stay away. I will secure that the cheap resources come to our countries. I will secure that there is a stability, certain stability via free trade, which benefits the people also more in the global north. So it's also a concept which helps us to understand the current move to the far right in Europe, and also maybe in your region.
I understand that this theory helps to understand the current European affairs from the Eurocentric perspective, because you also mentioned sometimes that you are more or less still picking from the Eurocentric perspective. But I wanted also to make more emphasis on what do you think, how this perspective can be helpful for understanding our situations, then making sense of our societies in post-socialist or the global south, societies like Georgia, for instance.
Yeah, I just arrived here and I'm very curious and I'm learning a lot in these days, and so I can ask some questions. One question of mine would be to critical thinking or to people in Georgia, what is the aspiration of the upper class and the middle class towards the West? And what was also in the transition period in the 90s, what was the promise of modernization? Modernization always means capitalist modernization. Modernization means westernization. But behind this, it's a liberal market, it's a certain form of politics, a liberal state, and so on. So my first question would be, what strengths has a modernization discourse, a development discourse, the concept of development, to be closer to the West in Georgia? And what does it mean for the middle classes and the upper classes? Because we should not forget these discourse, these strong understanding of development usually, and this shows history, benefits the rich and the powerful because they decide over investment. The discourse of development is usually not about democracy. It's not about weakening the elites. It's usually about strengthening the elites, strengthening the experts. So my first question would, what is an alternative space against this imperial mode of living. The first would, of course, would be, what is the imperial mode of living here? What are the consumption patterns? What are the aspirations of people, of certain people in Georgia? And the second would be, what is also an alternative? And the alternative, if we think with the imperial mode of living, does not go only via politics. Of course, we need progressive politics. We need transparent democratic politics against oligarchies, against clientelism. But we need also a more structural change of society. We need to change the economy in the sense that we need alternative forms of economy which really can secure a good living of all Georgians, which would mean probably a more ecological agriculture, which would mean a good public transport system, which would mean good education, a good health system, local production, and not only to be intertwined into the global processes. Yeah? So these are questions, I cannot answer them. These are questions which should be raised because an alternative to the imperial mode of living would go hand in hand with what we call a deglobalization. This would call to produce more for a good living for all Georgians, or for all people in Georgia, not for the Georgians only, in Georgia or in the region, and not to refer constantly to the world market, constantly to China and others. I'm aware that in Georgia, you won't produce cell phones, of course, yeah, the high tech not, but there's a lot of low tech. And there are a lot of textiles and others, and where do they come from, and in what sense this is menacing or doing damage to the Georgian economy. In this sense, I think the concept might help.
Speaking about the environmental problem, since you work on this issue more specifically, do you think there should be, or there is some difference with regards to how states should react to this problem in global north on the one hand and in the global south on the other hand? Because, I mean, certainly there is this big question of who bears the responsibility for climate change and who should carry the burden of it. And especially in these small societies and states like Georgia, where in fact there's no industrial production taking place, we always tend to ask what should be our response to it, and also the other aspect of it how to deal with this kind of a very tension dilemma between the development and going green.
First of all, concerning the first part of the question, no, the responsibility of global environmental destruction lies in the global north. There's the concept of climate debt, for example, yeah, that in the last 200 centuries, and especially in the last 70 centuries, after Second World War, it's mainly the emissions, the destruction comes from the global north. Of course, you need also in Georgia effective environmental politics. You should not pollute, you should not waste, there should be recycling and so on. But I think the main problem is in political discourse that still the field of the environment is separated from other politics fields. So if we talk about the environment, usually in politics we talk about a separated policy field, environmental politics. And then we should clean up the environment, we should be a bit more effective recycling and so on. I would propose the main question for a country like Georgia and others is how to make a good society. How to have a good living for everybody in Georgia, which means to have a just society, to have economic effectivity, to have good products, and to have also ecological sustainability, because we know that usually the poor are more affected by environmental destruction than the rich. I don't know Tbilisi, but I can imagine that the rich people live in better neighborhoods than poor people who usually live close to the large streets, to, let's say, they have more environmental damage. So the question would be to link in Georgia a discourse, I would say a post-development discourse, because development usually means to approach the West, to become as the West. And this usually denies the power structures which are inscribed into the world market. Yeah? So the development discourse always says there's a country, Georgia, and this country should develop. And develop means capitalist growth. But it denies that we have world market competition, that denies we have transnational corporations, that denies we have geopolitics. So my argument would be, but more as a question, since I don't know what's happening in Georgia, to go beyond development and the developmentalist thinking, to say what are the conditions of a good, just, democratic and ecologically sustainable society? What are the economic, political, cultural preconditions? And to start with this would reject the discourse on development which usually benefits the powerful. if we say development, we mean, the smart young people should go to the West, should do development studies, should come back as experts and so on. But this is stabilizing a power structure. This is stabilizing a hierarchy, because the poor people or the people who are not educated, they don't know what is development about. The elites know what is development about, but they mean Western development, but this is not to create a good society for everybody in Georgia. So a post-development thinking would really say, what is a good public sector? A transparent public sector, not a corrupt one. What is a good and effective system of production with private property, with public property, with solidarity property. And then we can also start to talk about the environment, but not as a separated policy field, because this usually means, here's the economy, here is financial sector, here is social policies, and then comes also environmental politics. Now we have no time, we have to develop. And when we developed, then we will clean up the environment. This is a false thinking, I think.
But do you think that this post-developmental approach is politically feasible?
Yes, if you don't name it post-development, but if you name it how to create a good society in Georgia, how to weaken the elites, how to weaken transnational capital, the mining capital, and how to really have, as a process, it does not start tomorrow, how to have a discourse, and then political initiatives to say, how want to we structure Tbilisi as a city, the transport system in Tbilisi, how can we not to get rid, but maybe reduce systematically the dependence on the automotive, on the automobile, how to have a very good public transport for everybody, not only for the poor and for the lower middle classes, but for everybody. In Vienna, since 2012, in the city where I live in Austria, there was the peak that now more families in Vienna don't have any longer a car. So they don't, culturally, the young people don't want a car in Vienna, but because there is a very good public transport system. So these are the mechanisms which would, in the effect, result that Georgia doesn't have to import so many cars.
But in Vienna, there is also the case that there is a big, substantial state subsidy, like municipal subsidy, that goes into the transport cost of the everyday transportation of the citizens, right? Yeah,
it's a political decision to say we want very good public transport, and there is an annual card. You pay 365 euro, which means €1 per day, which is quite cheap. And this is subsidized by the public state, because the city says we want this good public transport. I would say, as a biker, there should be even more policies against cars in Vienna. There are still many cars, but just to give you an example, it's a public decision to say, okay, we want in Tbilisi or in other cities or also in the countryside, we don't want to have so many cars. I don't know how is the food structure and the agricultural structure in Georgia. But I can also imagine that there is a debate how to replace the import of certain food stuff and to have more agricultural and hopefully ecological agricultural production in Georgia. These are the processes, and this is far beyond environmental politics. It's really to create a good, just, and then also sustainable society.
I'll go to my last question now. You mentioned you worked for Latin America for long, and you probably can share some of the experiences that could be meaningful for our societies now. So maybe you can talk about that also.
Yeah. In general, of course, it's a huge issue. There is an understanding in Latin America that they have their role of most Latin American countries in the world market since colonialism, since the 15th, 16th century, is to produce resources, minerals, fossil fuels, and agricultural products for the world market. Eduardo Galeano, a famous Uruguayan writer, called this the open veins of Latin America. The open veins, and that the blood from Latin America is for the world market. And there is a lot of debate since many decades on the dependency of Latin America. I would like to focus on the recent experiences. Almost 20 years ago, they started something what we call the pink tide, the kind of the move towards the left, towards progressive governments in Latin America. Hugo Chavez was the first who won the elections in Venezuela, end of '98. Then it was Lula da Silva in Brazil. It was Uruguay, Argentina, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the so-called progressive governments. And I'm not so familiar with Georgia, but what I could imagine, and yesterday we talked also about Armenia here at this conference, that one very important lesson learned in Latin America is that when the progressive governments and the progressive parties won the elections, and the presidents came from them, yeah? Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, Kirchner in Argentina, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. If you win an election due to a movement, to a strong social movement, and you are in power, you are only the head of the state and you are only the party. But you, at this point, the work really starts. You have to change the state structure and you have to change the society. So the error many governments did and their parties, now we can change the society from above. Now we are in power and now we will change. And this was not the case, that the state structure, which is very corrupt, very clientelist, very person-oriented, they call it caudillismo, the leader should decide and should say. So this is a danger, and a good society, a transparent democratic society, needs also to change the very state structures and to overcome clientelism, corruption, that the state officials feel really responsible for the making of a better society. I would say this is a very first lesson. The second lesson is that in the moment when the progressive governments were established, when they won the elections due to social mobilization, they committed the error to think that now the politics is done by the state, and they weakened in all countries civil society. And what is of utmost importance is to maintain a critical discourse, to maintain from the own movements, from the own forces that brought you into power, a critique of your politics. If you give this up, you would think that you have the truth. In these days in Nicaragua, yeah, Daniel Ortega, he thinks that he's really, he knows everything. He's the old revolutionary leader. The third lesson, I would say, is very interesting and very important, that in the moment of political success, you also need to attack the economic elites. You need to weaken them. You need to bring them into a more democratic process. What happened in Latin America is that the progressive governments didn't weaken the economic elites. They also benefited from the income, from the distributive politics of the state. There came a lot of money in due to China, to the demand from China. And the last lesson I would like to share, since you talk also here a lot about populism. What I learned in Latin America, and also, if you like, in Southern Europe, in Spain and mainly in Spain, a leftist or progressive populism which plays the game we against them, a dividing discourse, is very important in a moment of mobilization. You can say, we, the people, against the elites. And this was very powerful in Latin America, and also with Podemos in Spain. A populism which really says it's not we against the migrants, this is right-wing populism, but a progressive populism would say we repoliticize injustice and we repoliticize power. But when the governments came into power, they maintained a populist discourse. They said there is black and white. Chavez started with this in around 2005, not at the beginning. The experience in Venezuela was really fantastic during 5 years, very much from the bottom, very much with the people. But then Chavez said, now we start with the socialism of the 21st century. And then he said, now we, the Socialist Party in Venezuela, we have the truth, we know everything. And if you criticize us, you are our enemy, you are with the right. And I am a member of a research group in Latin America, and we criticized from a solidarity perspective, the governments, from a leftist perspective, from a social movements perspective, but the governments accused us to be with the right. And so what you need when you are in power, you need the ability to compromise, you need the discourse of the gray, beyond the black and the white. And I would say when you have strong progressive forces, you might look at Latin America and these very, very important experiences, because I close with this, we should not underestimate that since 2000, 2001, the whole world went to the right. With the attack of the Twin Towers in New York, with the war against terrorism, with the defeat of the so-called liberal democracy, the new middle in Europe, yeah, with the weakening of the social democracy, the overall tendency globally was in the last 20 years, 18 years, towards the right, with exceptions. And Latin America was the laboratorium, was the space where really leftist forces were strong. And this is, I would say, even more important to analyze carefully also the achievements, the successes but also the errors, and to learn also in other countries.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions.